Welcome to the Nordic Mythology podcast. I'm Daniel Farrand, owner of the company Horns of Odin. Today I'm joined by a good friend of mine, Tim Nancarrow. Tim, do you want to let people know who you are and some of the weird things that you get up to?
Certainly. As Dan said, I am Tim Nancarrow. I'm a PhD student at the University of Newcastle in Australia, so literally the other side of the world. So my research area focuses on exploring depictions of sacrifice rituals in Old Norse mythology. I've got a bit of a penchant for saga literature as well. Outside of that, I think Matthias last year described me as a ritual specialist, and I kind of like that. I don't know that I deserve it, but I'm as loaded as the term is, for the sake of being, quixies and heuristics, a practicing pagan. I have a series of, religious rituals that I carry out, spiritual engagement and immersion, draw upon the extant body, as much as we know of it, of Nordic religious traditions in the Viking Age and sort of pre-post conversion, and as complicated as that is as a landscape. Obviously, I do my own things with it. I don't ever try to dictate, proselytize, bloviate. I do my thing, and it tends to be a very private and sort of very personal thing. But there's this really, really lovely convergence that I've been finding, especially lately, that things, as I get deeper into my research, there's insights that I get from that better inform my ritual practice outside of academia. At the same time, then the this transcendental phenomenology that happens in my world as a ritual practitioner. There's things that I walk away from those experiences that I can then take back to the material that I'm working with, the historical record, the archaeological record. I get some really, really interesting sort of convergence and cross-referencing between the two.
Mm-hmm. That was a good intro to say that we just did half an hour unrecorded, just hanging out talking, which I seem to be making a habit of at the minute, which I need to stop. But on that note, that gives me a good little segue just to say, if people do want to watch the episode live and get extra material where I do just hang out and talk with the guests prior to hitting record, you can support us over on Patreon/Nordic Mythology Podcast, and you get a bonus episode every week where we do a Q&A after the main show, where you can ask ask the guests your questions, and they also go up on the Patreon after, so you can listen to them after the fact as well, or submit your questions ahead of time. And there's a story time with Jonas Lorentzen on there as well, and it's £3 a month, so it's not too bad, and it helps keep things going. So that's my little segue from disaster, a little bit of self-promotion from the fact that we lost out on half an hour recording, but I feel like me and you, Tim, can talk for hours, so we'll be absolutely fine.
This is my whole night. I'm like, okay, I've got my Guinness, I've got a little bit of chocolate here. The one thing is, if I drain this next one, I may be like, oh, quick, give me 10 seconds to go to the fridge and grab another. Yeah. Not that I'm a piss head, but it is Saturday night, and
you're Australian. Come on.
Cultural stereotypes. Yeah,
you're an Aussie. I'm a Brit. This is the one thing we just get.
Yeah.
So things don't need any conversation. We're just like, yeah, we like it.
I had a very because I wouldn't normally think of myself as someone that drinks in an excessive capacity at all. I am aware I drink more now that I'm older than I did when I was a much younger man. But the International Saga Conference I went to last year, which was in Finland and Estonia, and the pre-conference registration was on the Sunday Arvo, and I remember having this chat to one of the academics there and saying, I'm only on my second beer, it's a cruisy Sunday Arvo, and I'm basically on holiday. I was on long service leave from work for sort of 5 or 6 weeks gallivanting around Scandinavia and having the time of my life. But I think he'd already sort of had this impression from when I was at the Old North Myth Conference in Reykjavik the year before, And I just sort of, like nonchalantly just, I'm just having a couple of beers. And he's like, oh, I'm not at all surprised. I'm like, oh.
You've got a reputation.
He's just not to proof.
It's, especially for us, I think the problem with Scandinavia is the beer is so expensive. So we're just like, this is hard now, because we will just have like I'll go play rugby later and I'll have a couple of beers after. It's just like a thing.
Yeah, it's a common part. Australia is exactly the same. It's such a large part of our, I guess, the fabric of the social landscape. Even going to someone's house for like a backyard barbecue, there's almost always and I think it's really nice. Sort of the after echoes of Germanic hospitality is, I brought you some beer. Well, ripper, we'll crack into it and we'll share it, and and it can be the social lubricant and all of those sorts of things. But it's, I guess, the punishing thing is, or mimosas, Bob. That's a very good point. We have particularly, so Newcastle, where I live, was originally very much like a blue collar town. We had the BHP Steelworks, and then when the Steelworks closed, sort of the late 80s, and we had this really nasty earthquake, like one of the worst ones I think the worst one in Australia to date. It was sort of around Christmas time, 1989. So I was only quite young, but extensive damage all through Newcastle, and then we had this sort of urban blight, urban decay, recession. Now Newcastle has bounced back enormously, and so we've had like the gentrification thing happen here. So once upon a time, you go out and you had, Tooheys old, Tooheys dry, Tooheys extra. Oh, sorry, I should say Tooheys extra dry, Tooheys new. We don't drink Fosters, right? So you didn't have a lot of choice. Now you go out and there's like 50 different beers, and you've got like pink sweet and sour beer, or you've got
there's everything. Yeah.
And, it's mental. And as cool as it is, because there's so many flavors, the beer is that much more expensive now. So it's sort of a weird
whole
sort of paradigm.
The whole rise of like the craft ale, because some of them taste like shit, and some people fucking pretend they like them because it's cool, and I'm like, you don't fucking like this because this doesn't taste good.
If you'll indulge me, I want to read something, and it's a conspicuously British classic, I should say, just to kind of set the scene, because I've been reading this over and over a couple of times, and I think it acts as a really, really good example of I guess how to look at things. So for the audience, I guess to try and simplify it, if you've got, so when you go to do a PhD, it's the creation of new knowledge, et cetera, and there's a lot of different lenses through which we can view historical things. You can come at it from an anthropology angle, an ethnography angle, a historical angle. Obviously, Matthias is amazing as a philologist, but then he's been able to branch out into these other areas as well. You've got some amazing feminist scholars in this day and age, which is really, really cool, because traditionally the feminine perspective on all things history was more or less either unintentionally or deliberately sidelined or repressed. So, the field is, particularly at the moment, the field seems to be exploding with all of these really fascinating ways of looking at, the Viking Age, Viking religions, Nordic mythology. But in looking at ritual particularly, this is right from the start of the Mervyn Peake novel Titus Groan. This is, Gormenghast, and it's like a fantasy series, but it very much focuses on these really interesting relationships around courtly etiquette, which in some ways is, there's a thing I want to dig at there at some point in an academic capacity about the relationship between later receptions in, we'll say, descendants of Germanic culture and how they relate to the original courtly etiquette of the Viking Age, with skalds and how we conduct oneself in the mead hall, the laws of hospitality, all these sorts of things. So bear with me and I'll try and get through it quickly. Very little communication passed between the denizens of the outer quarters and those who lived within the walls. save when, on the first June morning of each year, sorry, let me find my glasses. On the first June morning of each year, the entire population of the clay dwellings had sanction to enter the grounds in order to display the wooden carvings on which they had been working during the year. These carvings, blazoned in strange colour, were generally of animals or figures and were treated in a highly stylised manner peculiar to themselves. The competition among them to display the finest object of the year was bitter and rabid. Their sole passion was directed, once their days of love had guttered, on the production of this wooden sculpture. And among the muddle of huts at the foot of the outer wall existed a score of creative craftsmen whose position as leading carvers gave them pride of place among the shadows. At one point within the outer wall, a few feet from the earth, the great stones of which the wall itself was constructed jutted forward in the form of a massive shelf, stretching from east to west for about 200 to 300 feet. These protruding stones were painted white, and it was upon the shelf that on the first morning of June, the wooden carvings were ranged every year for judgment by the Earl of Groan. Those works, judged to be most consummate, and there were never more than 3 chosen, were subsequently relegated to the Hall of the Bright Carvings. Bear with me, and just try and think about the details that are coming through here. Standing immobile throughout the day, these vivid objects, with their fantastic shadows on the wall behind them, shifting and elongating hour by hour with the sun's rotation, exuded a kind of darkness for all their colour. The air between them was turgid with contempt and jealousy. The craftsmen stood about like beggars. Their families clustered in silent groups. They were uncouth and prematurely aged, all radiance gone. The carvings that were left unselected were burned the same evening in the courtyard below Lord Groan's western balcony, and it was customary for him to stand there at the time of the burning and to bow his head silently as if in pain. And then as a gong beat thrice from within, the 3 carvings, to escape the flames, would be brought forth in the moonlight. They were stood upon the balustrade of the balcony in full view of the crowd below, and the Earl of Groan would call for their authors to come forward. When they had stationed themselves immediately beneath where he was standing, the Earl would throw down to them the traditional scrolls of vellum, which, as the writings upon them verified, permitted these men to walk the battlements above their cantonment at the full moon of each alternate month. On these particular nights, from a window in the southern wall of Gormenghast, an observer might watch the minute moonlit figures whose skill had won for them this honour which they so coveted, moving to and fro along the battlements. When we look at ritual and the sparse descriptions we have, between the Poetic Edda and the Snorre Edda, the Snorri Sturluson Prose Edda, and we look at the Islendinga Saga, the Fornalda Saga, the Kings and the Bishop sagas, we look at these sort of artifacts of a culture created right towards the end and in that transition point. And we get details in each of them, much like the passage I just read out from Titus Groan. You've got depictions of objects, their shapes, sizes, colours, the relationship and the value that these artifacts have to those that worked on them or created them, those that receive them as an audience, those that then consecrate them, utilize them in a sacrificial context. But what you also get, and this is one of the things I find so incredibly engaging and personally really, really fascinating, is sometimes the details that in and of themselves you might not think mean that much, until you start to think about, well, what is the significance of that thing? You sort of go through this eidetic reduction. Taking that sort of passage as an example, people are expending their lives to create this thing of wood. There's no guarantee it will be selected. In fact, the highest probability is it will burn and they will get nothing for it. Only a select few their creation, their sacrificial offering is actually saved. They gain an honorific, but it's a temporary honorific. It's access to another place, another sphere of a higher threshold in a social hierarchy that otherwise they are forbidden from even seeing. They're not even considered as an entity worthy of, let alone even perhaps necessarily existing in a way that you or I would think about it as you would treat another human being. But then you get all these other little things. Only 3 carvings are retained. The gong beats 3 times. The objects are on display all day in the sun, but then you have this lovely contrast with the darkness of men and women's hearts. You've got internecine strife bubbling just below the surface of the social order, the social hierarchy. And it's not necessarily let's rise up and overthrow those that live beyond the walls inside the castle of Gormenghast. It's conflict with one another within the same stratum of that society. It's only when we lapse from daylight to moonlight, we shift from light to dark. We burn the offerings. We have a temporary conflagration. And then after that, the next time we see these artists is look at the reward they've gained. They're bent over, hunched backed, because they've spent all year carving and piss-farting around with this wonderful little totemic artifact, and they get to march on the battlements, but they only get to do it 4 times. Each of them sort of does it once, and then they do a roster. You do it January, you do it February, you do it March. And so this is I really love that, because I think it's a really lovely example of when we look at ritual, and particularly as far removed as we are from Viking Age ritual and Viking Age mythology and religions, the ways in which you can take different elements of a ritual and you can start to understand the significance of even the most minute things. So rather than going, oh, well, everything's ritual, no. But you're also trying to evaluate the relationship of the symbols, the signs. You're trying to make meaning from, well, what's consistent here? What's different? Odin sacrifices a body part for various reasons. Tyr sacrifices a body part for various reasons. We look at the funeral of Balder after he's accidentally killed by Hod, his blind brother, who's just trying to have a lark and gets set up by Loki. And Balder's wife is sacrificed on his funeral pyre, on his funeral barge. Prior to that, there's they chop the head off the rooster. You then jump over to Ibn Fadlan's Risala, the description of the Rus Viking sacrifice on the banks of the Volga. They cut the head off a rooster. They lift the woman up above the wooden frame. I mean, and we even see this in popular cultural receptions. Yeah, there's that thing in the Northman when spoiler alert. So
it's all right. It's been what, a year?
Like everyone should have seen it by now.
It's been a couple of years, I think, actually.
But he kills his cousin, his uncle's son, and when they're doing the funeral rites there, it's the same thing. The young woman is lifted up several times to look above the doorway, to look over the wall, to look over the threshold between this world and the next. And I know a lot of people hate it, but the 13th warrior, lo, there do I see my father, lo, there do I see my mothers, my sisters, all these sorts of things that are, it's ripped straight out of Ibn Fadlan. So when we're, and this is ultimately, I suppose, the point I'm trying to get to, squirrels aside, the reason my approach that, I've tried to distill it down, looking at it through a semiotic lens and looking at it from hermeneutic phenomenology, there's 3 things here. What are each of these little elements, these contributory factors mean in the overarching design of the representation of this ritual in Nordic mythology? Looking at it independently, what does it mean within the context of that ritual? What does that same symbol or sign, that poetic metaphor, however you want to frame it with meta language and nomenclature, what does that same element then mean in another sacrifice. If I use rope over here, or a magic rope, to bind the Fenrizel, I know what that's about. I'm trying to thwart and prevent the prophecy, Twilight of the Gods, the God of Damarung, the Ragnarok. But then I go to Helgekvida Hundingsbana, and old mate is trying to run off with the Jarl's betrothed woman. They're young lovers and they're trying to thwart destiny, and they get caught, and he gets hung up and strung with a rope. So what is the relevance of the rope between a mythic depiction of a sacrifice and a legendary / other style of a sacrifice? Then we look at, look at the hanging motif. We look at Odin hanging himself in search of numinous knowledge, to cross the boundaries beyond life and death and, get this knowledge that he otherwise couldn't get. And then, old mate, he just fell in love and she was promised to another man, and he tries to circumvent destiny and he gets caught and he gets hung. So this is less of an offering and more of a punishment. So is there a correlation then back to, in Odin seeking to transcend and gain numinous knowledge, do we interpret that as, it's purely a sacrifice, or is there an element of a societal judgment or a societal value upon, well, if you get strung up with rope, you're breaching a rule, you're breaking, you've broken, or you've transcended deliberately and intentionally, you've transcended a boundary in terms of our social values that otherwise most people don't do that. And so in stepping beyond that, you've sought to either A, separate yourself from the rest of the society, B, transgress against that which everyone else holds dear or considers as a valuable aspect or behavior, not coveting another's wife, as an example. Or C, you're this, wonderfully intrepid, courageous outsider that basically says, I don't give a fuck about the rules, because what I'm in search of, and I know I pay a heavy price for it, but what I'm in search of is actually more important than the day-to-day, like like your daily mundane rituals. They don't matter to me, because what I'm in pursuit of is so much more important, is so much more valuable.
Mm-hmm. So where would you, is there a distinguish between like a punishment and a ritual? Where did you find that kind of line? Because yesterday I was in Llandudno and I went up onto the Great Orme, and on top of there was a settlement at some point, and there was a thing called the rocking, I think it's called the rocking cradle or the cradle rock. The rocking, no, the rocking. I think it's okay. That I got it. I got it. It had two names. No, because it has two names. So it's either the rocking rock or I think it was Tudno's cradle. I was putting the two names together. But basically, it's a rock, and it was said that it was used as like a judging tool, and the person would stand on it, and if the stone rocked, then you were found to be guilty, and then you were thrown over the cliffs, which is quite ritualistic, but it's also a punishment. And so I wondered where you thought that kind of boundary lied between just punishing somebody for wrongdoing, but also having like a ritual aspect to it.
Okay, so I guess and I really should have prefaced this at the start. These are my thoughts alone. They are my perspectives informed by my research and practitioner. That's not to say my way is correct. Like all scholars, this is what I think. This is and that maybe sometimes shifts to belief and sometimes shifts to a certainty of knowledge. But it's a spectrum based on an amalgamation of various things. All scientists effectively have some sort of subjective response to stimuli and the artifacts that we explore and study. So, the prevaricating aside, I think it shifts, and if you look at, say, take as a contrast, what would you say is the theoretical value of a human life, generally speaking, in our era, in the modern contemporaneous age? We value human life mostly, and exceptions to every rule, but by and large, we value human life reasonably high. You don't, unless, you're some arsehole fuckwit politician, you generally don't want to see other people suffering, certainly suffering needlessly. You don't want to be perpetrating harm against the innocent. You want to be a good human. You want to look after your fellow man and woman. And I think that's, I don't want to say should, but I think that's a very noble thing. And I would certainly much rather live in a world that values human life than expends it needlessly. However, we jump back 1,000 years, you've got much higher infant mortality rates. The level of, we'll say generally speaking, the level of education is different. The level of access to resources, whether it's healers and law masters, witches, crones, druids, seers, vulva, there are some incredibly advanced skill sets, and you still had back then, I think, a reasonable amount in certain areas, and depending on the culture, long-standing traditions of indigenous competencies and proficiencies in certain things. But the value of human life perhaps wasn't the same as we would regard it now. Obviously the death of an innocent is always a tragedy, and I would like to think that was the same back then, but we can't ever know necessarily for certain. And different cultures have a different relationship to mortality and to the concept of death. So when we look at sacrifice, and in relation to your question around, well, where is the I guess the threshold of the delineation between, well, this is a punitive exercise, I will kill you because you have broken a law, but I'm going to do it in a really cool sacrificey way because it's sick to hang people up or cut their heads off or whatever. I think there's room to allow for both, but ultimately my perspective is any act of killing someone carries a certain amount of ritualistic overtones, and especially when we talk about a punitive thing, you've got you jump all the way back to Tacitus. You go to the Roman historiographers, and you get these wonderful descriptions about. And I'm not going to say I agree with the value judgment, because I think it's pretty heinous actually, but this sort of, basically all ancient Germanic people or the Germanic tribes, homosexuality, sodomy, that's a big no-no. And when you commit that crime, we go and we drown you in a bog. And it's not done, it's still ritualistic, but it's not done in front of everyone, because we don't actually want to draw attention to the activities, the behaviors that you have engaged in, because we don't actually want people to pay attention. This is I guess the way he presents it, Tacitus is, he sees that as a negative thing. There's odium, there's shame, there's reputational dishonor, as far as he wants us to think, in the way that the Germanic tribes view homosexuality, and therefore, we're going to expunge the criminal, but we're going to do so in a way that doesn't allow for celebration, doesn't allow for mythologizing around what they've done. We want it, it's a dirty little secret, just go and get rid of it, but in a way that it still has a sort of, I said, these ritualistic overtones, because this is an act of, if you want to go down scapegoat theory, we're all basically the same until, okay, well, here's a thing we can pick on where you've deviated from that norm. And because, the sky is falling and we're all terrified of something that is different, something that is unknown, or something that potentially destabilizes or challenges the status quo, that's new, that's scary, that's different, I don't like it, therefore I will punish it with extreme prejudice, but I will do so in a way that makes it clandestine. It's a very surreptitious, secreted away sort of thing, and that's very different from when he describes like the the sacrificial chariot with, we wash the chariot, and there's almost sort of this funerary procession, and we go to the sacred grove and do all of the other things.
So
at the same, sorry,
just to pull it back before we go too far off, because before you kind of went down that path, and I was very much thinking that the loss of life was a big part of a ritual, because even if you locked somebody away in like modern society, put them in prison for 200 years, like some American sentences are, which still baffle me that that's like 400 years you're in whatever.
7 consecutive life sentences.
Yeah. But even if you were to lock somebody away for what is the remainder of their life, that doesn't feel ritualistic. But if you did the electric chair or lethal injection, where you have like a little viewing platform where people can come and watch, and there's this whole theater around like strapping them down and putting the little, it's not a hat, is it? It's not whatever the fucking little electrocution, the little
the skull cap and the wet sponge.
Yeah, the little thing on there that does the job, or strapping somebody down and putting the different chemicals in. Like that does feel very ritual, and almost like it's and then it goes on to the second point you made. It also feels very deterrent based. It's almost like this is what's going to happen. Look at how almost that feels also why maybe they let people come and watch and have the media gallery, because it's like, come and watch, come and see, because this is what's going to happen if that. So it is a punishment, but it also does have that. And I never thought of it like that, as having that kind of ritual feel to it. And it is quite.
What I guess then that's like you highlighted a really, really good point. So if you look at, so there's some really great scholarship around rituals, Viking Age rituals. There's really great scholarship around pretty much fucking everything from the Viking Age. As I said, we live in a pretty fucking good time. But there's some stuff. So Jens Peter Schultz has looked at it. There's a number of really, really good scholars have looked at it. And if you take, so Catherine Bell was this amazing religion/ritual scholar, and her work has been very, very influential in the field. Schultz and a few others have taken a lot of their cues, maybe not taken a lot of their cues, but certainly have been influenced by her work. And so they sort of have tried to come up with this sort of classification around, well, how can we, in a relatively straightforward way, how can we categorize rituals from the Viking Age? And there's sort of your cyclical, seasonal things. There's your community / personal private ones. And then there's your, so cyclical, continuity, and then crisis as a response to. So when we talk about sacrifice rituals as a method for, I guess the immediate thing is someone's broken a rule, has gone against a social taboo. And that's, you could look at that through classic bloody, what's his name? René Girard, scapegoat theory. You go, okay, well, in a time where you have relatively homogenous societies, anything that's sort of seen as a deviation from that is cause for concern, because it potentially acts as a destabilization agent or catalyst. So we need to punish it post haste. By making it public, by ritualizing it, what you're doing is whether people are really like consciously aware of it and identifying it as such, or whether it's something sitting latently in their subconscious to sort of slowly bubble away, you're searing into the collective public memory. This person has committed an act so heinous, so anathema, such a willful, horrific, obscene abrogation or a contravention. It's not accidental. Usually they see it as, this is a deliberate transgression. Everyone, look at this example. This is what not to do. This is how badly this person has fucked up. We end their life. But we still want there to be some sort of gain. And there's a really interesting thing there that I don't know that I quite have an answer for yet around, it's one thing to take a voluntary sacrifice victim, someone that says, you know what, I'm ready to go. I want to nourish and nurture the gods with my lifeblood. Take me, I'm ready, rock and roll. That's very different from, oh shit, I've broken a law, I've broken a societal code of conduct, I'm being forced to. A sacrificial prisoner of war, even more so. You're being sacrificed against your will. So there's a really interesting question there for me around how does the consent element of a sacrifice victim play into their perceived or actual value? Could you have inadvertently, could you fail to appease the gods if the sacrifice victim is somehow tainted by lack of willingness or, too enthusiastic consent? This idea of throwing the spear over the enemy force you're about to fight. Well, Odin owns ye all. Well, that's awesome. So who cares if they consent or not? Because that's a war sacrifice to honor the war god. He's happy to because he wants more warriors ultimately for Valhalla and for the Ragnarok to come. So they're all warriors. Sick, more numbers is better. You contrast that with some of the interesting interpretations of the Rus Viking sacrifice in Ibn Fadlo's Journeys Through Darkness and stuff. This description about the bride that is going to be a human sacrifice on the deceased lord's funeral barge gets blasted off her tits on alcohol. Well, does she actually want to drink, or are they basically putting a funnel in her mouth and going, here, you're the keg queen, and then all these guys are going to have their way with her because she wants it. She's going to have this last experience of joy and ecstasy and lack of inhibition and alcoholic grandeur. Well, is it that, or have you just drugged and raped this poor girl because she doesn't want to join her lord in death? She very much wants to live, but these are the rules. So I guess ultimately,
to go on to consent as well. Even I imagine even in some situations where the participant appears to be completely consenting, it is, I want to go to appease my god and go to whatever is after. Even that could be quite blurred because I guess it depends on the situation leading up to it. Obviously, there are a bunch of people who've joined cults and then sacrificed themselves willingly, but does that mean that they really wanted to, or were they just coerced over a period of time to get to that point where they believed that was the correct and right thing? It's still, even like 100% consent still can have a little bit of a blurred line to it, depending on the path that's taken to get there, I feel.
Well, so an animal basically can't consent, but we did it anyway, and still do in some cultures. I mean, I openly acknowledge it. I have done ritual sacrifice with animals. I will continue to do so. I don't do it in a way that is cruel and inhumane, and I try to make sure as little of that animal goes to waste as possible. There's meat, there's blood, there's skins on my lounge. I sleep under these blankets, so I don't have to go and buy a sweatshop blanket. That aside, when we're talking about entities, so we'll say sentient creatures that are capable, at least during, let's say during the Viking Age, that would have been capable of consent, so by and large just humans, you raise a really interesting point there around what would consent have looked like back then? How much of the social conditioning around a sacrificial mindset, and particularly the ritual mind, and I'll take you with the squirrels down that journey in a minute around what I mean by the ritual mind. But if you grow up in a culture that has a a dramatically different view on life and death to what you or I would recognize in the modern era, where, well, like a glorious death, a famous death. Well, there's reputation, and I get the thing I want. I get to go to Valhalla. I get to see my brother. I get to see my father. I get to see, my mates that I used to play with on the farm. I'm one of the last men standing. I miss those people that I had relationships with. And so if there's an opportunity that comes up, well, we would like a representative member of the community that has standing, that has value, that has reputation already. How much of a greater, more valuable, more reverential offering does that person represent than, some two-bit bloody bread thief or whatever? And right, so to address the punishment mechanic. But then also, this person has grown up and has been steeped in this culture. They learn the stories, they learn by example, they see the way that their elders are talked about, the way their peers are talked about, even their understanding of, like these really cultural touchstones around, Odin did a sacrifice to, gain knowledge and wisdom, or whatever else. You look at all the stuff that Sigurd goes through, in the slaying of the dragon, Reagan, his mentor, turns against him, and he has to kill someone that he used to love. So I guess looking at all of those things and the weight of that around, how does that condition someone or inform and influence their mindset, so that if someone says, we actually need a volunteer today to, string up or whatever else, who among you will step forward? And then there's also a really lovely question. Maybe the outcome's not so lovely, but who will represent the community? Who will give the ultimate of themselves to benefit the rest of us? And that leads through then to ideas around sacral kingship. And I know most people hate the Golden Bow and James Fraser. They're like, I don't know, it's all crap. But I'm like, there's still some value in looking at his ideas around, the fertility god, the vegetation god, the god that is the king, I should say, the divine ruler, who is responsible for the ongoing prosperity. And if he fails in that role, well, what better to do than sacrifice him? That gives you accountability for leadership, responsibility, but it still functions, that sort of cyclical renewal and playing with those spaces between that which is living and that which is dead.
Mm-hmm. I would love to be. Do you think that's how it happened? Was that there was just a crowd, and they were like, "We need somebody who's gonna put their hand up," and because I would love to be in that crowd and just look around at everybody, kind of going, maybe not me. Kind of the eyes. There would be a pressure also, I think, to even probably if we were just dropped there now, and there was this situation where they were like, we need somebody, and you kind of just in the moment, I'm sure there would be some sort of social pressure to be like, oh yeah, fuck it, I'll just do it, even though like you don't really want to. I imagine it's there.
Yeah. So then that as you flagged, like what then does that say about what is the actual value, or what is the reality behind informed consent for a sacrifice victim? If you've got, you've got the aspect of the ritual performance, you've got the weight of social judgment, you've got cultural conditioning. Go on, man, like you should totally do it. You should do it. Yeah, like you're older than us. You've already had a good life. You're by much ready to go. Oh
yeah, and your mate's just gonna like put your fucking hand up for you, like grab a hold of your wrist and like think it's funny. Think it's funny. Like, oh yeah, he'll do it. And I'm like, fucking hell, well, no.
I just saw Alyssa just flagged a really, really good point. For those communities, would that have been the ultimate honor? Now, generally speaking, let's say as a general rule of thumb, to get into Valhalla, you have to die in battle. And we'll say you don't want to be a coward. You want to have a warrior's death, a glorious death. This isn't necessarily battle, but it's still a glorified death. There is reputation, there is honor, You have served the community. You have demonstrated, I would argue, immense bravery, immense courage, because there's no guarantee what sits at the end of that rope is anything other than lights out. Culturally, you're conditioned to believe, but unless you are a ritual practitioner, or a berserker, or someone that has some sort of a little bit of an outsider status that is played with liminality, you can't know. There's belief, but there's not knowledge. And belief, traditionally, like if we want to look at it semantically, belief is still potentially going to come from a place of, I think that's a thing, but I don't know for certain. There's a sense or a potential element of doubt. Knowledge is that's a given. I take that for granted. So
do you think they would have that doubt though? Or do you think
I think it would
the
be
gods were just as real as the tree outside or the sea? Like, because to some people, when you get to, usually I think today you would call it more of like a fanatic, but like you have, without doubt, like Christians, I'm sure in every religion, there are those people who are like, this isn't a belief. Like, I know this is real. This is it. This is what happened. And that's to us, where like, that's their belief system. But to them, they're like, oh, no, this is 100% true. I have no wavering doubt. So like, if you're in that position, then does that make it easier to then go, okay, I'm going to be the one who's willing to put my life?
Right, so you and I are friends, and you've heard some of my stories. You know some of the things that I get up to. And certainly you were there last year. For me, there are several really strong elements of my religio spiritual framework that propagated and motivated that sacrifice ritual that I did. I gave myself up willingly. Now, I knew what I was going in for. I knew what it was I was seeking. I knew the mechanism. I knew the elements I wanted to utilize. Whether I would survive it or not, it was belief, right? So all of the things around it was knowledge. There was certainty. I knew I was going to go to another place because I've done it before. And this is where looking at ritual with phenomenology is about, well, what is the individual practitioner's experience? What did they get from it? So instead of being purely academic and going, here are the elements, here's the activity, there was or was not an outcome, you're trying to take the things that sit inside that and around that to go, well, there's actually a lot more to this than just looking at it in concrete corporeal terms, and there's a really sharp divide, unfortunately, a lot of scholarship when we look at ritual between, well, there's the belief stuff, there's the thought, and then there's the action. And scholarship sort of either views one as the more important or the other. It's, that great dichotomy between myth ritualists. And this is sort of, I guess, one of the things I love about being in a sort of unique position as someone that sort of embraces both. I can say with, I don't even need to put hand on heart. Like, I know I have seen what I believe to have been representations of the gods. As I know it, it was the gods. Was it, sitting here like you and I are talking to Odin? I've had that experience once, and so much went into it that if I went down that road again, I know how significant and severe the price is, and I'm not ready for that level of transcendence again, because it's very much there's a finality to that choice. Mm-hmm. That is a terminal point. But then there's other things I've done where, I see familiar signs. You see things in your dreams, and then in the waking corporeal reality, you see this semiotic motif. It replicates consistently. And so when you think about, okay, well, how willing is someone how willing would someone be to go into that sacrifice? How much confidence do they have in the outcome, knowing, well, yeah, I'm going to die, but it'll be worth it because of X, Y, and Z. Anecdotally speaking, as someone that has gone through that experience multiple times, obviously, and I will, full disclosure, there was only one where it was very much a terminal threshold, And obviously I'm still here, so I'm cutting it pretty fucking close.
Mm-hmm.
But when we play with life and death in a ritualistic capacity, the more certainty you have, where you shift from I believe to I know. I've seen irrefutable evidence that I can't unknow that now. I cannot unlearn it. And as a result, it doesn't matter whether I want to believe it or not. It simply is. Because that's irrefutable, it then becomes concrete as much as the sun will rise tomorrow. I don't believe that. I fucking know it will. The only potential element of problem you have then as a willing sacrifice victim is, what if the sun doesn't rise tomorrow? Okay, and that's I guess that's the one little seed of doubt that I wonder, subject to different experience levels and whatever else, because like the ritual, personal, spiritual beliefs, religious practices, religious knowledge, I will say, to really be concrete about it. How many times can you look at a thing and say, well, I can't unlearn that now. That this is a definitive thing. I cannot refute it. I cannot deny it. Even if I want to, at what point does the seed of doubt disappear completely? You brought up fanatics. There are men of a particular religion in the world that we all know about that literally blow themselves up to kill innocent people on the promise of, I've got 72 virgins waiting for me in paradise thereafter. And that's not to single them out. There's martyrs and fanatic extremists of all faiths, persuasions, political ideologies, religious ideologies. But that's I guess that sort of shows you the intensity of the ritual mind, is that when you live day to day with the mundane, the profane, right? You want to Mircea Eliade, he's a famous Romanian scholar that looked at a lot of these different things, and that sort of binary modality around religious worship, ritual worship. What the fulcrum of ritual mind is that transcendental state. And when we talk about it, especially as a public sort of a public activity, a community activity, that's that would burn so severely into the cultural memory of those people. You think about the descriptions that Adam Bremen gives in Gesta Hamburgiensis of the sacrifice at Uppsala. 9 of every animal and nine men strung up, heads cut off, and we collect the blood and we, the halot, we bathe the great carved wooden effigies of the gods. That might have been my best mate. And here's his corpse swaying in the wind. Mm-hmm. You don't forget that sort of thing. I mean, even last year, I go up and I do my thing. So how much of the community pressure is on the practitioner or the victim? I didn't know how many people were in that hall. I didn't give a fuck, because that wasn't where my mind was at. So when we engage in when we set up, or in the Viking Age, the community sets up with all of the right symbols and cultural touchstones, a ritual space, I think a lot of those things probably fall away. And then therefore the victim, especially if they're volunteering, consent, I would argue probably, for at least in some instances, would never have even been a consideration. They would have gone into it going, I'm not thinking about my community. I'm thinking about the gods. I'm going to meet the gods. I'm going to transcend, this shell. I shed that. I go beyond. And imagine, the pull of that as I don't want to sound fatalistic or, suicidally ideative or anything like that, but if you think about the relationship to death and mortality and the positive aspects that Viking culture, I won't say everyone in the Viking Age, but those who engage in the raiding and battle and warfare and songs of glory and heroism, like, fuck yeah, man, I'm ready to go. String me up, and it would be incredibly hard to try and I think walk back or deprogram yourself from that level of cultural conditioning. Moreover, once you're in that ritual headspace, there shouldn't be, I think, a reticence. As someone that's done it myself, I want this. I've chosen this. I know what it means to me. I know the inherent value. I know what I'm going to get. I may not know the form that it takes, but I know I'm going to become more than I am now. And I know what the value of this means for the gods or God or whatever it is that I'm in communion with. You're effectively you're creating an eruption of the sacred upon the profane. You're transcending, I wake up, I make my coffee, I go and have a shave, I have a shower, I get in my car, I go to work, I do the thing, I answer some emails. Forget that bullshit. You're living in a higher state of cognition, a higher state of awareness, cognitively, spiritually, physiologically. Your perception has shifted. So when we talk about reality, the corporeal material, I can't fly, but once I choose to shed the limitations of the profane world, and I embrace, I touch the sacred, I enter into that space between, I see more than I normally can in the profane area. And that sense of religious ecstasy, and this is where, the interesting interplay with fanatics and martyrdom and willing sacrifice. I mean, even someone that didn't necessarily want to, someone that didn't consent to it, but under the right conditions, if you shift from a sense of belief, ultimately coming from a foundation of doubt, like I want to believe, but I don't know for sure. Once you shift to that element of certainty, I can do anything. Nothing can stop me. And I'm absolutely going to do this because I will give my life to the gods. What greater meaning could there be? I can go and fucking dig up a farm and I can grow potatoes and have a miserable cantankerous old wife that hates me, and I can have my I've got to watch, half of my sons are going to go to some foreign land far, far away and die, and I'll never see them again, and I'll get to sing songs in their honor, but I miss my little boys. Or the other half will be constantly bitching, pissing and moaning about, when are you going to drop dead, Dad? Because we want the farm, because we want, we want resources, we want glory, we want reputation. We need to create a life for ourselves. And based on the laws of, inheritance, until you shuffle off the mortal coil, I haven't got jack shit. And, there's not a lot of farmland to go around. Imagine, the poor Danes, it's half of it's fucking swampy marshes. It's shit. It's not good for growing crops. So there's a lot of these really interesting social conditions there that I think would absolutely make someone not just willing, but probably like fervently, like, vociferously enthusiastic about, well, fuck yeah, here's a thing that is just for me and I choose it. No one gets to take it away from me. No one gets to say no. It is between me and the gods now. And as I understand in the contemporary era, it probably sounds quite perverse, but I think there's a really lovely poetic thing to that.
It sounds very depressive. Like, it sounds like that kind of, that sounds quite like a depression state of like, there's nothing else. So I'm going to
But remember,
have a go at it. Like, it's life's like, it's tough. There's all these other things that kind of are stopping the progress, or you're past a certain point in your life where you can't. And it's just that's kind of the impression that it's given.
Well, let's take as an example, Eeyore, Scarlet Grimson, right? And he's this raging Cajun sort of, he's a berserker guy, he's a warrior poet, and his honor, his reputation is so important to him. When he goes and he works for, I can't remember whether it's King Egbert or King Athelstan, I think in the saga. It might be King Egbert. But he basically goes and plays mercenary for one of the English kings. And his brother dies. So they're both there, and his brother dies. And then he's sitting there, in the hall later, and everyone's feasting and having a jolly good time, and he's there just furrowed brow, like King Conan of Aquilone, he sits there with a mighty furrowed, troubled brow. And the king tries to engage with him and says, we won, jolly good. Like, and, you were a badass on the field. And like, how great is this? Can I get you some more ale? He's stoic, he's silent. And he's almost, without trying to be disrespectful about it, he's almost like a recalcitrant child. Like he's almost throwing a bit of a tantrum. And it's not until finally, because the king comes from I guess a different sort of mindset. The cultural values are different. And then finally, he's upset about his brother and the sort of the pseudo wergild. I've given him a bit of gold, but clearly I haven't honored this man enough. I haven't honored this man's loss, this man's sacrifice in the form of his brother. And so he he throws a heap more riches at him and offers him, he sort of, talks him up and gives him, much more laudable praise. And then, he'll, sort of shrugs it off and he's like, okay, cool. My honor is satisfied. And the inverse then when he has the falling out with, I can't remember. I think one of the Gunlauds and King Eric at the time in Norway that Eneil has a falling out, and part of his inheritance that, by the complicated laws of inheritance, it should have gone to him. But then this dude's sort of gone, oh, well, actually, this other guy that, he's one of my Jarls or one of my Carls, I'm going to give it to him because I'm trying to curry political favor and he's closer to me politically. I need to maintain that relationship. So no, Ale, you actually don't get the thing that perhaps you deserved. And so, he erects a scorn pole there and lays down this, wonderfully caustic curse upon them. This guy represents, like the creme de la creme of like this warrior, this martial culture. When he gets to the end of his life, and he's writing his poetry, and he talks about how, like the women of the village where he is, like I think it's, I don't know, his son's village or his grandson's village or whatever. He's old and he's gone to seed. He's got blind. He's sort of gone a bit blind. And I think he actually had Paget's disease or something based on descriptions of the deformities of his skull. Jesse Bjork had a really, really cool thing about that, but that's, if anyone wants to look that up. But the women there basically pay him out. They said, you just lay around in front of the fire all day, like warming your feet and your legs, you're useless. And, big old Ale, you were this, Viking badass back in the day. Look at you now. You're a bumbling old coot. You can barely look after yourself. The sting of the shame, the diminishment of his honor, like back in the day, they would have absolutely wanted to wed him and bed him. They would never have dreamed of giving him this sort of scathing rebuke about his lack of capability, his lack of masculine capability. And so if you think, well, I can live to be a ripe old age and get tongue lashings from these wenches and harlots of the village that don't appreciate all of the value and glory I covered myself with through my younger days. Is that a retirement I want to look forward to, where I've gone beyond my ability to, I no longer have the ability to be what my culture suggests is something worthy of emulation. My reputation, all my glory days are in the past. What have I got left to look forward to except, old age, indolence, senility? So if you look at that as a potential outcome for your life, and I can only speak, in terms of the martial ethos, I could look forward to that, or I could skip all that, and I can go to Valhalla now and keep being a badass and a warrior, and my reputation remains undiminished because I go out, I've never been defeated, I've had my adventures and stuff, and in the end, I have chosen to walk into a sacrifice ritual and give myself to the gods, to nourish the gods, to benefit my community.
Mm-hmm. See,
sorry, I know that's a lot.
No. But without going like too dark, I guess, is that kind of mindset of this is my choice and it can't be taken away comes across as quite he's quite suicidal in a sense of, I feel like that's the mindset a lot of people get in, is like the life has gone a certain way, or is going a certain way, and this is now my thing. This is what I have, and this is the choice that I have that nobody else can change, and that's the path that I'm going to take. And it sounds very kind of similar to that, albeit it's very, things can be very different, but it's also, but the mindset of it, just, that's what's ringing a bell in my head of that thought of getting to a point where it's like, oh, well, I can either go down this path of getting old, or I can make the self decision to go this other path. And that's kind of, that's just what light lit up in my head of like the similarities there. And I don't know if it's just purely coincidental or if there is something further there between like those two mindsets. And then I also I also thought on the back of that, I wonder the belief in what body you took to the afterlife, as to whether if you died an old man, would you take the old man body? So is it better to go when you're younger, when you have the younger body, when you're in your prime, you still can fight? Because it's also, if you have this warrior mindset and you're going to go to an afterlife where you're going to be fighting every day, you want to do it where you're in your prime and you can really make a difference. You don't want to be going to the battle with an old achy body where you're making the groan.
40-year-old man body.
We're on the limit now. We want to be getting there soon.
I mean, look, it can. I definitely agree that there is a lot of correlation and a lot of overlap there between, I guess, and it can be a really confronting topic for a lot of people, and I am mindful of that. So I'm not trying to make light of suicidal ambition or anything, because it's a really difficult thing, a really confrontational thing, and it can be such a, it does. I mean, still, in an era where we try to do so much around caring for one another and acknowledging mental health issues, there is still so much pain and so many complications around that sort of thing. It's really, really heavy stuff. And that's not to say that didn't exist back then either. And I absolutely would never want to suggest that, most Vikings, they were basically suicidal because, if they don't get to die in battle, then they're like, cool, well, send me off to Odin, because either way I get what I want and I don't have to grow into this, doddering old fool that everyone makes fun of because I'm not a Viking badass anymore. Not at all. I guess I'm just playing with some of my ideas around what the mindset might have looked like for some of them, based on where we can see, in cultural representations of, these sort of both legendary and even the sort of the historic figures from the Viking Age that represent the Viking Age mentality. And it's an interesting thing to see in the sagas, because in the sagas you get, Sasha described it so wonderfully, and I've totally stolen it. And he'll get a chuckle out of this when he watches the episode. A lot of that material, it's not necessarily a genuine like for like, this was absolutely Viking Age religions. I think there are definitely elements that are from that era that are untainted and uncorrupted, but there's a lot of complexity to it. There's Christian colorings as well, and there's that sort of interplay where there's both sort of coexisting simultaneously, not always without tension and conflict. But Egil particularly, in Egil's saga, is almost set up sometimes, I think, in some of the descriptions of him and the way he responds to things as, he's sort of an archetypal representation of Viking Age values. You look at other warrior types in the sagas, and they're actually a really interesting sort of contrast against it. That they don't subscribe to those same values. So you can see those ideas sort of already in flux during that. And so it's sort of, Sasha's thing is that this body of literature, I guess as a general sort of, I guess a bit of a, throwaway soundbite, they're snapshots of the memories of paganism. There are some pockets in, insular parts of Scandinavia where, no, like the old gods still reign and we still have our traditions as they have evolved over the years. We still do our thing because, we're on the outskirts of civilization. But, jumping right back to Tacitus, the Roman historian, he sort of really embodies with his whole Germania this idea that, civilization is the innovation of mankind. The closer to civilization you live, the more refined and sophisticated and the less savage and barbarous, but you grow weaker, you grow more luxurious, more decadent. And so those that live in the periphery of a particular culture, the sort of the redneck Swedes, the rural Swedish, funny punny people, like the last of the Viking age pagans to convert by some accounts. Well, they're the furthest, or at least the communities they're talking about are the ones, right up far north, are much like the Sami. They're not encountering really until sort of 15th century onwards the pressure to convert and let go of all of their indigenous traditions. Whereas, dudes that are living in and around, Trondheim and Reykjavik and, Hedeby, and like these centres of learning and education, but these centres of power, they've already converted and have done so for several hundred years. So when you, I guess holistically, when you look at how we get ideas and concepts of ritual sacrifice communicated to us through what little remains of the records, and certainly the written records, I don't think there's a singular account of contemporary sacrificial practice other than maybe if you look at the Icelandic sagas and you take it as, it's myth history, but this one was probably a bit more historical and this one was probably a bit more, creative writing and whatever else. You talked a while back about I want to say the Tudmo stone, but I know that that's not the right word for it. And it wobbles and, much like the old, okay, well, we think you're a witch, so we'll throw you into the water. Mm-hmm. And if you sink, well, you were a virtuous maiden. And if you float, well, you're a witch, so we'll drown you anyway.
Yeah.
There's some interesting relationships between drowning as a sacrifice modality. And then when you go back to the old Roman accounts of the Germanic tribes and they're, bog bodies and things like that. There's interesting, I guess, some interesting coincidences between the semiotics of both of those. But with that stone, and then, okay, well, if you're guilty, we throw you over the cliff. In the Freysgodi saga, he's this Icelandic chieftain guy, and he's pretty argy-bargy and somewhat conceited and arrogant, and people don't like that. And he has this horse, and it's Frey's horse. He's a priest, a Godi of Frey, of God, and he consecrates this horse, and that horse is just for Frey. And then he tells one of his slaves, okay, I need you to go and check the livestock out near the fence because they've been wandering. And he's got to, something happens, and he's got to get there quickly or get back quickly. He borrows the horse, and so Hravenkel Freysgodi kills the slave. You've sullied the horse, you've tainted the sacrificial artifact, and he cuts him down with his axe. And then events happen, and he gets overthrown temporarily. And so they get his sacred horse, and they decide, we'll offer it in sacrifice to the god in the usual way. They throw the horse off a cliff. Now that's very, very different to when you look at the archaeological record at Hofstadter, where they've excavated, there's post holes indicative of a hall, perhaps a cult house, maybe, don't know. But there's a whole heap of decapitated horse and livestock skulls. So, well, there's no real consistency between those two sacrifice modalities. And that's sort of then where I'm looking at the Nordic myth cycles and saying, okay, well, we've got variation throughout the sagas, and that's fine. What do those variations look like in the Nordic record, in the mythological record rather? And is there actually and interplay between the two. So if we think of these things as like, this is sort of the last stages of paganism / the last sort of cultural memories of it being handed down through oral tradition, and then we're committing it to writing. So there's some really lovely stuff, from Stephen Mitchell and Pernilla Herman, based off the Jan Usman stuff around memory studies, and how these primary religions that are so focused on oral retellings and skaldic performance, how that informs, well, when we take memories of these rituals and these activities, as I said, with the performative aspect of a sacrifice ritual, you're not going to forget 9 guys getting their heads cut off and strung up and the blood being used to paint an effigy. Even if you're in a culture that celebrates that and thinks like that's fucking cool, you don't forget that, because it's such a profoundly elemental sort of spectacle. Once you start writing it down, and we'll say a couple of 100 years after, funny things can happen. And there's a scholar, something or other, Janssen, and he uses this beautiful German word, Erdelmet, which is when we enact a ritual, we carry out a ritual that is semantically depleted. In other words, we do the action, but we don't have any of the thought anymore. We don't necessarily understand why we're doing it or what the significance of the thing is. We just do it. Every all right, New Year's Eve. We get New Year's Eve every year, okay? And we do it with fireworks, and everyone gets pissed out, and it's awesome and it's good fun. Why do we have alcohol and fireworks on New Year's Eve? We still do the ritual pretty much the world over. Right? So when you take that idea and you apply it to these snapshots of the memories of paganism and the representations of them in the mythological corpus, it raises some really interesting questions around, I guess what I find so beautiful about particularly the Poetic Edda, because I'm adamant there are genuine pagan elements in there that predate Christianity. Yeah? And if you compare it to, rune stones and archaeological artifacts, it's a no-brainer. It's not hard to get a boner for this was actually a thing, at least at one point in history, at least in one part of the world. There's some big ticks there, at least for me. But when we talk about semantically depleted rituals, you get these descriptions of, an Odin went to Yggdrasil and he hung himself and then he got the runes. And once you start to unpack each of the different ritual elements, I guess what I find really beautiful about it is I can't help but wonder, this is a theory probably everyone will fucking blast me for, but I can't help but wonder what you see in the Poetic Edda is a cultural explanation for this is how we created our religion. This is how our religion came to be. We don't fully understand what all of these elements mean anymore, but we remember enough about it to be able to construct approximations. Then when you move to saga literature, there's I think a really similar sort of thing, but then you're getting the creepage of the Christian influence. And this is ultimately why I'm studying it, because I think it's fascinating to watch this shift from, this was a thing that was always just known. It was a cultural thing. We just knew it. It was definitive and concrete with, regional variations over time and whatever else. But then you get to this point where they go, well, now we're going to try and capture it as best we can as a static encapsulation, but in doing so, it's giving another life to it, and you've had Claire Mully on the show, brilliant scholar, what Claire is doing, and it was a thing that she said when her and Shell were on the show about anyone that plays with these myths, that performs them, that recreates them, that engages with them on a deeper than surface level, you're becoming part of that tradition. You're taking that ancient knowledge, and in a sense, you're contributing to the continuity of it. It'll change and evolve, but there are certain fundamental elements that never change. Odin always sacrifices himself on a tree for various reasons.
Mhm.
Okay. Tyr always seeks to bind Fenrir. You know, there's some wonderful creative interpretations of that Tyr was the only one of the gods that wasn't afraid of Fenrir and actually befriended him and was his friend and loved him and adored him, nurtured him as more than a pet, like a brother, like a companion, until the day came when the All-Father says, it's too risky. He can't be trusted. We got to lock your dog up and Tyr's like, well, he's my bro. You know, it's Rocco. I don't want to lock Rocco up. And the only way I can
one's
do
locking
this,
Rocco up.
no.
His little tail's going now. He's heard me say his name. His little tail's firing out.
But you think about the enormity of that betrayal between those two, if that relationship existed, and then what does that mean for the sacrifice? Tyr is effectively relinquishing his godhood as a war god and as a warrior. He's giving up his ability to defend his family, to fight for his family at the utmost capability to bind this creature that he might actually have had an enormous amount of compassion for. You know, and there's some really, really interesting things that you don't, you know, when you take a reading of any of these things, and this is, you know, hermeneutic phenomenology is to be blunt, it's kind of, you know, it's a bit of an academic wank word, you know, it's a buzzword. But when you pick apart what that actually means as a lens, as a way, a mechanism for interpreting what do these myths actually mean? And when we look at sacrifice events, what does a sacrifice event mean? And what do each of the elements mean in relation to one another in an isolated event? And then in relation to the rest of the mythic continuum. I mean, there's some really great stuff. I won't waffle about it now, but you know, I did a thing last year at the Saga conference around severed heads as sacred objects, as sacred artifacts. Now, the archaeological record certainly says, well, you know, we found a lot of skulls, so, you know, probably meant something. Mm-hmm. You take a hermeneutic reading of the semiotics that sit around. When we talk about heads in the Poetic Edda, the Snorri Edda, the Icelandic sagas, we talk about heads and people saying, "Oh, well, I'll wager my head." You know, Valthrudnismal. You get another thing in some of the prose elements in Regensmal about Andvari the dwarf and and the brother Otter was killed, and so there was a wergild that had to be paid so that Loki didn't lose his head. And he says, you know, we paid a high price to save my head. This notion of a head carries some sort of proportional value in relation to either transgressions of conduct, in terms of something that you can actually bet with. You know, if I'm skinflint and I want to go and have a run on the pokies, can I bet my head against it? And if I lose, what does that actually mean? How valuable is that head then? Now, without drawing too long a bow, right? There's a reasonable attestation of like the Celtic warrior headhunting tradition. Okay, where I was looking at severed heads, sacred artifacts, etc., and the relationship of decapitation in in sort of, I'll say, like Viking cultural things. There's a really interesting thing. You go a little bit further back to where you've got, I'll say, like sort of the really cool Celto-Germanic cultural fusion, you know, cultural borrowings, you know, the Latin and the second Latin or Latino art styles, and all of the cultural knowledge that goes behind it. You know, when you do loopy-doopy, swirly animal motifs. Where else have I seen that? You know what I mean? So there's really interesting things you look at there that then you look at the culture that was responsible for that art style. You look at the peoples that inhabited the regions stretching from, the Schleswig-Holstein and Holstadt all the way across the Rhine and into what was, ancient Germania. Those art styles move. Well, surely the stories that sit behind them move to an extent. And so then you have potentially this sort of really interesting multicultural transference of these, deeply held cultural ideas about things like, mythic beasts, mythic motifs, but then the cultural values behind them, such as decapitation. And I've lost count of the amount of times I've gone through, various, saga literature and Nordic myth stories where someone's talking about, I'll cut off his head, or so-and-so went to, cut his head off, or yes, I wagered my head. I mean, Eorl saga, the Hovardlarsen, it's one of his most magnificent, or one of the most cool poems attributed to him in that saga, where, he goes before this king that has a beef against him. And he sits there with his friend, I think it's Arnlog Grim or something. And he says, you've got tonight basically to try and come up with a way to convince the king not to kill you in the morning. And so he composes this drama to try and basically blow smoke up the king's ass to make the king go, oh, well, Eorl's actually a pretty cool guy. He thinks I'm cool. He doesn't disrespect me anymore, and he's doing so publicly, but it's a gamble. The king may not take it. The king may go, you know what, you're blowing smoke. You've embellished beyond the point where, because the rest of the audience know what my exploits are. They know who I am. They know my character, what I've achieved, etc. So if you put too much smoke in there, everyone's going to know it's bullshit. I'll look like a fool. You will lose your head. And obviously, he succeeds because he's a magnificent skald and whatever else. There was a point there somewhere, but I lost it along the way.
Don't worry about it. We should probably wrap this up. We've been nearly an hour and a half, and we're going to do some questions after. I tried to play back earlier. I wasn't suggesting that you were saying everybody in the Viking Age was depressed and suicidal. It was more it got my mind thinking about how suicide is the ultimate sacrifice, the ultimate ritual. And then it also of that idea that you have these people who had a lifetime of glory, and then when that disappears, it leaves a hole. We see time and time again in modern culture of usually like sports personalities or musicians who are on top of the world. They have the world kind of at their fingertips, the glory, the fans, the wealth. And then when that disappears, it's left with this giant void that's usually filled with some form of depression. And so it was just something that I'd never really thought about in the Viking world, never really explored. So when it kind of, you were talking about it started coming up, I was like, oh, this kind of, that might have been a part of this, because there is that kind of hole that's left when you imagine being, like you said, being a hero, going to all these fantastic places, having these stories and songs written about you with the wealth. And then as you get older and people start to disrespect you, because it is a time where physical ability holds a lot of value. You can hold your own, and you can be violent at the right times, quote unquote. It holds a lot of weight.
Sometimes the wrong times too.
Yeah, but it holds a lot of weight and earns you a lot of respect. So when that starts to fade and you can't anymore, I imagine the respect starts to
decline. And
decline, yeah, because you always get someone younger, bigger, stronger who's going to come along and want to make a name for themselves. Because I know quite a few people who, they're into MMA fighters or boxers, or you hear stories of professional MMA fighters who they'll go on a night out and there'll be those couple of people who want to have a go because it's the opportunity for them to make a little name for themselves. Like, oh, I fought so-and-so. Like Michael Bisping's one that pops to head that I've heard him speak about that. He's out on a night out and he has the fame, the notoriety of being a once UFC champion. Yeah. Now he's older. He only has one eye. He's older. And I imagine people would take the opportunity to be like, oh, well, it's the name that carries the weight, isn't it? And I imagine that's still held strong back then. If you had somebody who gets older and they start to decline, if you could, beat them in battle or beat them in a fight, you then absorb some of that name. And I wonder if that kind of decline had an effect mentally on people and they went down that route.
I guess just one last little thing to touch on there. So again, that sort of, I mean, that's a warrior, it's a martial culture. It's an honor-based culture. I guess as a cultural touch point, you think of the the samurai, right? Feudal era Japan, and not. There's obviously an enormous amount of differences, but this idea that life can be short and brutal and intense and violent, and if you want to get ahead, that's to quote the Tacitian idea, the German thinks it is far more noble and far more efficacious to risk the loss of a little blood to get ahead than to labor like slow and dull by the sweat of his brow. Why would he be a fucking farmer when he can just go and kill some dude and take his shit? Which kind of is the Viking ethos. You don't have that same sort of idea with samurai culture, but it's still a martial culture, and this is where that whole Bushido mentality comes about. To know life in every breath, because life could end theoretically very quickly and very suddenly without warning. If you're on the open sea traveling across, the English Channel, or you're sailing up and around in tumultuous conditions, you're raiding a farm, down in the next fjord, but you didn't know that old mate actually had 7 sons and they're all brick shit houses, and you're 5'5" and 60 kilo wringing wet. Things may not go your way, and that could happen very quickly. So the idea of, I guess, the intensity of that experience, and knowing that life could potentially end very violently, very quickly, but it's fated, and there's nothing you can do to change that. And that, I mean, we haven't got time for that now, obviously, but that whole role that the Nordic, the machinations that the Norns play in determining a man's orlog, his fate, or a woman's for that matter. If I know there's nothing I can ultimately do to change it, and even we see that, the fatalism of Odin himself, he tries so hard, but ultimately it doesn't matter because he knows where it's going. So, thing for another time. But this idea that you're probably, not all of them, but knowing that it is such a possibility, there will be those that will be absolutely terrified and shit scared of it. But there would be, I think, and one of the commentators actually dropped that, and it might have been Alyssa, a brilliant word, acceptance. I know that this is probably the likely trajectory of my life, whether it's in 5 minutes, 5 days, weeks, months, years. At some point, I am going to die. How do I want to die? I want to die on my terms. I want to die as a glorified warrior. And if I can't have that, or even if I get that, my life, I want to have meaning. And I accept that for that meaning to be created, a sacrifice may be necessary, up to and including my whole life.
There we go. There we go. We did it. I just want to throw in, for anybody who doesn't know your personal kind of sacrifice and rituals that you do, we have a video on YouTube that we've recorded at Midgasport. People can go and watch. Just type Tim Nancarrow into YouTube. There's a half-an-hour video of us sat on one of the burial mounds at Midgasport, and we talk more about the specifics of your own type of rituals and what you do and the mentality, so people can kind of catch up on that. Probably should have said this at the start of the show. Maybe through some type of magic, Ron could put it there, or people can just listen to the whole thing and then go check it out. It doesn't really matter. Tim, this is a lot of fun. It's always very fun talking to you, and you're welcome back anytime. Do you have a place where you want people to follow you so they can check out your work, or you just...
Look, the very condensed version, like I'm weird with self-promotion. It makes me feel uncomfortable. And as I said, like I'm happy to get up and play squirrel and be a bit of a prima donna and carry on like a dickhead, but I don't make a lot of my ritual practitioner stuff. It's a personal thing, and I do have a very small community of people that I engage with and ask me to help them with things, and I like to give in that sense. But I play in some bands and I write some fantasy novels and whatever else, but they're in various stages of progression. I don't care, man. I just honestly, it's just lovely to come along and have a chat about something I'm passionate about, and to be able to share that with you, because fuck, man, I miss you. Hey, we need to hang out again very soon.
We do. So, it is. If there wasn't, like half a world away. Is that an Oasis song? That's an Oasis song, right?
Oh, I remember Wonderwall, and probably that's about it. And there's that cultural divide, man. I'm not as British.
Yeah, well, they were very British. I feel like I could sing it. I don't know if the song's called Half a World Away, but there's definitely a lyric in there. But yeah, that's the biggest issue. Next time you're over this way or I'm over, I feel like it's a lot. There's probably a lot more reason for you to come this way than me to go that way. As much as I would love to go to Australia, whereas everything you're interested in is kind of over here. So I imagine the likelihood is you're going to be over this direction.
Yeah, I would definitely, if not next year, then the year after. But I'm pretty keen to come back next year. There's all of the best conferences in my area of specialization happen in Northern Europe,
of course.
In Scandi. Like heaps of my friends are up there, and I love Australia, but without it trying to sound wanky, like the older I get, the less Australia actually feels like home. Because like my family originally from Germany and Scotland and Sweden, so going there and being there, it's really special to me, and I hope to be able to do it more often. So if you do come to Australia, dude, awesome.
I imagine when a lot of your interests are in one place, you want to see things hands on. You want to be around things that you can pick up and touch, and other like-minded people that you can sit down and kind of have those conversations in person rather than like this. As lovely as this is, if we were sat, we could both be having a beer. And it's just a different experience, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a lot more.
It's one of the challenging things for me, I guess. And there's a couple of Australian scholars that, Manu, that I don't know if you've met him, but so he's not long finished his doctorate. Really, he was at the Saga conference as well and did this awesome thing on Thor and the sound, the fjord, that sort of thing. So he's in Sydney, so we catch up here and there. But for I guess Australian scholars working with Nordic myth and saga material, it is a unique sort of challenge to be, even with all the tech stuff, to be on the other side of the world. You're very much sort of like sitting there looking, there's another conference, like, oh, fuck, man, like I'm missing out. So, but I'll be back soon enough, man.
I'm sure you will. Okay, if you enjoy the show, please leave us a 5-star rating, positive review wherever you get your podcasts. And then you can watch the shows on YouTube and follow us just at Nordic Mythology Podcast on all the different channels. And if you want to watch live, again, you can just join us on Patreon/Nordic Mythology Podcast, £3 a month. And you also get the Q&A that we're going to do. We're going to do it now. We're going to let people ask you some questions, which is always a lot of fun. So let's jump straight into that.